This is the fifth installment of a chilling true crime tale we began unraveling a few weeks ago. In today's case, familial bonds are severed by a mother's calculated malevolence and brother's willingness to carry out evil plans, veiled as a gesture of love and devotion, which stands as a terrifying testament to the dark corners of the human psyche. Behind closed doors where shades of normalcy crumble, a mother's sinister plans unravel as she seeks to eradicate an obstacle to her grand design, which is the son-in-law standing in the way of her daughter's compliance.
The motive, as twisted as it may sound, revolves around the warped belief that murder is justified when control over one's progeny is at stake. What compels a family to cross the threshold of familial discord to premeditated violence? This question echoes throughout the chilling details of this crime, which will forever stain the tapestry of this family's history. Two young boys who have lost a father at the hands of their own family will be changed forever.
Hi everyone, welcome to episode 10. Today is part 5 of our deep dive into a case we began to explore a few weeks ago here on the Darklivity podcast. I am your host, Kimbyr, and I'm here with my co-host, my boyfriend, my best friend, Jonathan.
Hi.
Who I'm actually so proud of for getting better and better with each and every episode.
Oh, thanks.
You're welcome. A lot of people are saying it in the comments as well. I'm not the only one. And I'm also so glad that so many of you have been keeping up with this case and all of our updates. I know some of you hope we're going to be finishing it up, and I feel you, I really do. But I want to make sure that we cover everything so that we can make a playlist and add any new and upcoming updates, because this case is still ongoing. There are some new things happening. So we don't want to rush, and we still have some things to reveal to all of you, but don't worry, it will be well worth the wait.
So we're assuming you've already watched all 4 parts of this saga, but if not, here's the link up above in the cards and down below in the description. I'm sure some of you are glad it's coming to an end, and others probably wish we'd dive even deeper. Maybe we will.
But where we left off, the police had finally made their first arrest in Dan Markel's murder case. A man named Sigfredo Garcia with gang ties and a connection to Dan through his girlfriend, Katie McBanawa. She happened to be Wendy Adelson's brother's ex-girlfriend. Yes, that's a lot to wrap our brains around, but she was the thread running through it all. This whole conspiracy to kill this innocent man, a father of 2, all because of a spoiled brat that couldn't get what she wanted. What's more is it wasn't just that. It was the pure hatred that Wendy's mother had for Dan that was the fuel igniting this entire scheme. She had convinced her son, Charlie, who we know had the means to make it happen, to help her with her little problem in North Florida. Dan Markel and a chance connection between Charlie and a woman who worked as a receptionist at one of his dental offices he floated around to is all it took. She thought she had it all figured out, but they were all wrong. And now it was all coming undone. On May 25th, 2016, 34-year-old Sigfredo Garcia, the father of Katie's children, was arrested for first-degree murder of Dan Markel and possession of cocaine.
On the next day, May 26, the Tallahassee Police Department held a press conference officially naming Sigfredo Garcia as a suspect in Dan's murder. The documents were ordered and sealed by the judge. Sigfredo was offered a deal if he would only tell them all about the murder and implicate his co-conspirators, but he refused. The night before, on May 25th, Detective Craig Isom called Dan's mother, Ruth, to inform her that they were going public with information about the arrest, and there would be a press conference to follow. Ruth quickly called Wendy to relay the news, and in Ruth's own words, Wendy called her back several times, almost frantically, trying to get as many details as possible. When Ruth told Isom about this, he advised her not to have any more communication with Wendy. And guess what Ruth said in her book? This would be one of the last times she'd ever have an extended conversation with her.
I wonder why.
Uh-huh. You may be wondering what happened to the other guy we talked about in the last video, Luis Rivera. Well, it turned out he was already serving a 12-year sentence in federal prison for his involvement in criminal activity as part of the Latin Kings. His charges included things like robbery, kidnapping, trafficking, and drug dealing, amongst other things. Just 2 days following his best friend Sigfredo's arrest, Detective Isom went to have a chat with Luis about Dan's murder. Initially, Lewis denied any involvement in anything related to Tallahassee, claiming he had never set foot there. However, when presented with concrete evidence, including photographs of him alongside Sigfredo, captured on the bus surveillance footage, ATM transaction records, and GPS data, his previous statement was obviously proven false. Lewis said, "Okay, it's true, I was there, but I went there to check out some colleges with my friend, that's all." They knew he was lying. They had enough evidence to arrest him for first-degree murder, and on June 28th, he was transferred to the Leon County Detention Center in Tallahassee. Both he and his friend Sigfredo would qualify for the death penalty.
A lot was happening in the media. This was a big story, and it still is after all these years later, and soon you'll know why if you don't already. By June 2nd, the same day Sigfredo was in court for his first appearance, the unsealed probable cause affidavit connected to his arrest was released to the public. Not officially, though, but most likely through a news or media outlet getting a FOIA request and publishing the information to their website. The investigators didn't want any information released publicly yet because this was an open investigation, and they weren't done making arrests. But only people on the inside knew that. This affidavit had a lot of information, but one of the most shocking was the theory the investigators had about the motive for Dan's murder. It was stated that, quote, investigators believe motives for this murder stemmed from the desperate desire of the Adelson family to relocate Wendy and the children to South Florida, along with the pending court hearing that might have impacted their access to their grandchildren, end quote. To break that down plain and simply, they believe Dan was killed on account of Wendy not getting her way in court and being granted the right to move out of Tallahassee and back to Miami, and further to stop Dan from blocking Donna's unsupervised access to Ben and Lincoln. This revelation was huge. You have to understand the public didn't have all the information that you've gained from the past 4 videos we've done. Everyone was in the dark about why this random guy from Miami would want a professor killed. But now it was all making sense. The most shocking was that Wendy's own mother, a grandmother, Donna Adelson, and Wendy's older brother, Charlie Adelson, were both named in this affidavit as unindicted co-conspirators. And that's pretty big news. It's really shocking, and that's not all. The affidavit also announced 2 more people by name, Katie McBanoa and Luis Rivera, who were called suspected co-conspirators.
It was clear that the Adelson family is to blame for Dan's demise. They thought they were smarter than everyone else, more powerful than the law, and rich enough to get away with it all. After the first leak, more evidence was released to the public, including the bus footage, surveillance from the gym parking lot, and the ATM camera, all showing that green Prius with Sigfredo and Lewis inside. Of course, true crime consumers, websites, and media outlets were eating this up. There was a new story every day with breaking news, but what people on the outside didn't see was the effect it had on the survivors. Dan's family was deeply affected by the aftermath of his murder. They were quickly thrown into the spotlight in a way they never imagined or wanted. They were constantly bombarded with reporters, emailing, calling, finding them, and asking them to respond to the arrest and the information released. Ruth said in her book that they decided to remain silent. They were ordinary people unfamiliar with true crime and definitely not apprised of the American legal system or how it worked. They actually had to consult with the law firm in order to understand their new life. It seemed every time they stepped away from their devices, there was another break in the case. It was non-stop. It would make anyone's head spin. On June 17th, 2016, a Leon County grand jury indicted both Sigfredo and Lewis as co-conspirators in Dan Markel's murder. The court documents were finally released, and that's when the public learned about the connection between the hitman and Charlie Adelson's girlfriend, Katie McBanoa. As Kimbyr mentioned, it all made sense. The trials for Lewis and Garcia would happen back-to-back 3 weeks apart, with Lewis's on October 24th and Sigfredo's 3 weeks later on November 14th. However, Lewis's attorney, Chuck Collins, had other plans for his client. This wasn't Lewis's first rodeo. He knew what the consequences may be, so they went for a deal. In the legal world, this is known as a proffer. It's a plea deal, but it includes a tell-all. Lewis would plead guilty to second-degree murder, but he was also required to tell the authorities everything he knew about Dan's murder and to testify against anyone connected in the case for future trials.
But the craziest part, in my opinion, is that if he agreed, he'd only have to essentially spend an additional 7 years in prison. Yeah, because the deal was he would be sentenced to 19 years for his involvement, but it would run concurrently, meaning at the same time as a 12-year sentence he was already serving. It may sound like he's getting off easily, but there's more to it. The prosecutor in Dan's case, her name is Georgia Kappelman. She is the chief assistant state attorney in the Felony Division D in Florida. She served under the state attorney at the time, Willie Meggs. And guess what? She went to FSU, the same law school Dan taught at. She had a personal connection to the case, and she knew that conspiracies were very complicated, and they needed cooperation from at least one of the people involved in order to bring them all to justice. You know, it didn't surprise me that Lewis was willing to break away and go against his friend, because remember, he fired Sigfredo back when they were both working at that masonry job because Sigfredo couldn't stay clean while they were working. So it's no wonder Lewis would rat him out. After all, as you'll soon find out, it was never Lewis's intention or idea to kill anyone. Sigfredo was the one that was hired. On October 4th, 2016, Lewis met with Detective Isom, his lawyer, and a few other people in an interview room where he did what he agreed to, revealed everything under oath. He had to tell the truth. If they caught him in lies, the deal would be over, and nothing he said could be held against him, meaning they couldn't charge him with anything further if he admitted to things like selling drugs or other crimes. We're not going to play the entire interview. But as usual, there were a few very important things that Lewis said. All of it was important. But at the top of the list was who was responsible and how it all went down. I'm going to tell you this beforehand. They went to Dan's 2 different times, once in June and again in July when the hit went down. The first thing Isom wants to know is whether Lewis knew Dan Markel or anyone with the last name Adelson before the plan to kill Dan was set into place. Here's what he said.
Did you ever meet or know or hear of Daniel Markel? No?
Speak up loud.
Think if I heard about him?
Did you ever hear of him?
No, not at all.
Never heard of him? Never knew anything about him?
No, sir.
No one's ever mentioned that name before?
No, sir, not at all.
What about Wendy Adelson?
Not at all either.
Anybody else by the last name of Adelson?
No, sir.
Okay.
So he didn't know the Adelsons. Sigfredo was hired to kill Dan, and he wanted Lewis to go with him on the job because he trusted him. Lewis was unaware that the job Sigfredo needed him for was related to a murder. Lewis assumed it was a robbery job because, in his words, he's a jack boy. He's robbed drug dealers. That's his specialty. He would just assume if someone needed his services. That's what they needed him for, but instead, Sigfredo tells him he's getting hired to kill someone, and Lewis would get $35,000 just to ride along. So Lewis agrees. He said he'd been drinking all day and hopped into a rental car Sigfredo drove over, and they headed out to Tallahassee the first time at night and arrived early next morning. Lewis said he was the passenger and was drinking and smoking pot the entire time Sigfredo was driving. Sigfredo then hands Lewis a piece of paper with Dan Markel's photo with his name and address typed on it, and he told Lewis Dan drove a 4-door black car. When they arrived up north, Sigfredo flagged down a shady guy in the area and gave him $20 to rent them a hotel. The next morning, they actually drove over to Dan's and looked around the area. When they spotted Dan in his black Accord, they followed him as he dropped off his kids at daycare. But they soon lost him, so they decided to drive by his house several times that day. But Dan's garage door was always closed, so they couldn't tail him or shoot him if they wanted to. Instead, they went to Hooters to have some drinks and food.
Because that's what you should do when you're trying to actually carry out a hit.
The next day, they tried it again. Went over to Dan's in the morning, followed them to daycare, but again, they lost him. They didn't see him come out, so they drove around and they couldn't make the hit.
My understanding when he was talking to me, first I thought it was going to be like a robbery.
Just a robbery?
I thought it was going to be a simple robbery. But then as we kept going on talking about it, that's when he told me, listen, I got to come up here for a job. I'm finna get hired. We're getting hired, but to kill somebody. We got in the car and he told me more about it. Like, you gonna come out here? I'm gonna kill this guy. You're gonna get paid this much, $35,000. So I looked at him and I said, it's a little bit of money, but all right, whatever. Let's drive. We're driving. He showed me a picture of Markel. That's the first time I seen a picture of him and I heard about his name. But he told me his name. There's a guy we're gonna go see. His name is Markel. I don't need the name. Forget about the name because I'm not gonna remember the fucking name. Just show me the picture. I just seen the picture and I looked at him.
You said you initially thought that this was going to be a robbery. What gave you that idea? Why did you think it was going to be a robbery?
I'm a jack boy.
Okay.
I rob drug dealers.
Okay. So he was talking. He was talking in terms of a job in Tallahassee.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So I'm thinking we finna go. Okay, boom. But then he's like, man, it's not that. I'm finna go kill somebody. We're gonna get hired.
Okay. And he showed you a picture of Markel.
Markel.
And said y'all were gonna go kill him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, were you the one that he was intending to go do the murder, or was he? Why were you even involved?
Because he told me he trusts me. He said, I trust you, and you're the only one I trust.
But were you the one he was hiring to do the murder? Because I don't understand why you need two people to commit a murder.
They were hiring him.
Okay.
They were hiring him. They were not hiring me. They were hiring him. He said he's going to pay me to go with him because he didn't want to go by himself. I said, all right, let's ride. Got in the car and he drove. I was on the passenger side. I was running a blunt and we drove. I was drinking the whole night going that way. That's it. When we got to Tallahassee, that way we need to rent a hotel. First we met some guy that night. He rented a hotel. That's it. I just came out and scoped him out there. We see what he was about, where he go, what his routes. But every time he go to the daycare, I lose him because he used to take so long. So I'm like, man, this guy never comes back out. And then when I go drive back, the car was never there. Okay. So we ended up going back to the hotel and hanging out, just hanging out like we were partying. Like we was out here partying. Then we'll do the same thing the next morning. I'll wake up and try to follow him all over again to the same daycare. That's all. We already knew where he lived. We also used to him following this guy. I said, why you keep following this guy if you know where he lived?
You're in the passenger seat?
Yeah, I'm in the passenger seat at that time. You know, he was following him. I didn't drive the first night. So we always lost him because I guess when he come out, he hit the right and go that way towards like the gym. Never came back. So that we would leave. The first night we was up here, we left. We ended up going to Hooters. We ate some chicken wings, drank beer like crazy. Went back to the hotel, did powder and drank. Just hanged out. Like the first week we was out here, we just for 3 days. We just scoped him out for 2 days, maybe a day and a half, and that's it.
At some point on this trip, Sigfredo told Lewis that he was already given $5,000 up front by someone he referred to as the lady. And that's when Lewis began to understand that Katie was the one connected to this lady that was hiring Sigfredo to kill Dan because she wanted full custody of her 2 kids. Let's listen to what he had to say about this.
You said they gave him $5,000. Tell us about that. What did he say? Where did he get the money from?
Oh, he said he got the money from the lady. He still haven't told me her name yet. He said, I got the money from the lady. Well, his wife gave him the money. So Katie gave him the money. But he told me about the lady. He told me, yo, the lady got the money. She gonna pay us.
When Lewis, who usually robs people, found out that some lady had a lot of money, he suggested to Sigfredo to forget about this guy Dan. He had nothing against him. He didn't even know the guy. Instead, they should find the lady and rob her. That to him made so much more sense and it was easier. However, Sigfredo said no. He said he had to kill Dan because that was what Katie wanted. She was the one that hired him and they wouldn't get any of the money if they didn't follow through. Katie was the driving force behind this plan. She had told Sigfredo all the details. Everything came from her. She even called Sigfredo when they were on their way to Tallahassee and told him to call her when it was done. He did alert her the first day that it wasn't done because they couldn't track Dan down. They really went up there to scope him out, to see where his routes were. And every time that he went to the daycare, Dan would take so long inside. Remember, he used to have breakfast with his children that they would lose him. He wouldn't come out. They would drive back around. And when they did, his car wouldn't be there. And Lewis actually didn't want to kill Dan. He thought it was stupid to kill someone over the custody of kids. He'd never killed anyone, but Sigfredo thought he had. And that may be one reason that he thinks Sigfredo wanted him to go along. And at one point, he even tried to ask Lewis to do it. And Lewis said no. Lewis didn't think this was worth it. He tried to reason with Sigfredo.
So, all this driving around and talking to him about the money, I told him, we should just go rob her. That was my intention. This guy, I don't got nothing against that guy. I don't even know that guy. Especially after he told me about what was it for the 2 kids. Because I asked him, why are you going to kill this guy? Because the lady wants her 2 kids back. She wants full custody of them kids. Because he had all the custody. That was the plan, that was the deal. That's where we went to go kill that man for.
And how did Tudo know all this?
Katie, I guess Katie told him everything. Katie told him everything, and then that...
But you're just guessing that. You don't know that for sure. Do you?
No, that's for sure. For sure, Katie told him everything.
Right. How do you know that? How do you know Katie?
Because he stayed talking to Katie on the phone. Hey, babe, what's going on? Hey, the lady's gonna have... You sure she's gonna have the money on time? Tell her don't play with her because we'll go show up in her house. Tell her she better have that fucking money. And he always kept telling her that.
So when he talked to Katie, you could hear him talking to Katie?
Of course.
And you knew it was Katie?
Right there, right?
Did you know it was? Did you know it was Katie because of what he was saying, or could you actually hear her voice?
It's Katie. I can hear her voice.
And you had heard it before?
Yeah, I can hear Katie's voice. That's Katie.
How many years have you known Katie?
I know Tudo my whole life. And they've been together how long? However long they've been together. I think it's 10 years. How long I know them. I really know I really know why you're doing this for. You're doing this because of your stupid ass wife. Let's go. So I went with him. But it's all her. It's all fucking Katie's for winning this shit, man.
So they weren't together during this time? During the time of the murder?
She had him so messed up that he was drinking every day. Every day he would drink. Every day he would do coke. There wasn't not one day that passed by without that man drinking and doing coke.
What caused you to leave town? Why did you give up and just go back home?
Me personally, I told him, listen, man, I don't think this is gonna be worth it. That day, I'm like, this is not worth it, man. We should just get out of here. You know, I don't think it's bad. I like think about it, man. Man, you know, I gotta do it, the money, this and that. I'm like, all right, man, whatever. But we leaving. We left, and then about like a month later, the second trip, we like, man, I gotta do this, man. I gotta do this. So I just. You know, that day he told me that, I thought about it all day, like, what the fuck, this nigga's tripping. And it's all because of Katie, man. Like, she had him crazy. You know, she'll go cheat on him, and I guess she told him, if you want me back, you gotta go do this shit. Because when we came back, a week later, they were together.
Okay.
I told him the story.
All right.
He asked me, you know what, you should go in there and kill him. You should go in the house. I'm not going. Like, you know.
Why would he want you to go in and kill him? Does he believe you've killed people in the past?
That's what he thinks.
Have you ever killed anybody in the past?
Never in my life, sir.
You know you're under oath.
Yeah, never in my life. I put my hands up, and never in my life I killed nobody.
Okay.
I don't beat people with bats here with sticks and shit like that.
However, Lewis was responsible for getting the gun. Lewis actually paid $150 for it and bought it from a young kid on the street. It was a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson. Initially, Sigfredo was actually going to bring his own gun. It was a long-nose blue steel .38, and Lewis was like, that is a big gun. What are you trying to do, blow someone's head off? You're crazy. Obviously, that would leave way too much evidence. So that's why Lewis went out and got a smaller gun, a revolver, since they don't discharge any cartridges, which explains why they didn't find any at the crime scene. So Lewis admits it was all because of Katie that this went down, that she was messing with Sigfredo's head. He was messed up on drugs because he was so in love with her. And he insisted they had to carry out this crime because Katie was promising that she would get back together with him if he killed Dan. And sure enough, she did get back with him after it was all over. But that would come later. Remember, we were still talking about the first time they went out to Dan's and they did not carry out the hit.
You brought the .38 black short nose Smith & Wesson.
Yes, sir.
Where'd you get that gun?
From a neighborhood from a black boy that I know.
A neighborhood black boy that you know?
Yeah.
What's his name?
I don't know his name.
How long before did you? How long did you get it before? When did you get it? In a week before, the day of that you took the trip?
When he told me, he said he needed. When he told me, he said I need a .38 revolver. Cause he had showed me the blue stem, and that's a big gun. What the hell? Shit, you trying to blow somebody's brain? Are you crazy? He like, yeah, then find me a .38 small one. I said, you know what? I think I know where to get one. Cause I remember somebody trying to sell one around the neighborhood. So when I seen the black boy around the trailer park, I said, man, what's up, man? You still got that gun for sale? He's like, yeah. I said, man, I give you $150 for it. So I gave him $150 and got the gun.
Another thing that upset Sigfredo was that Katie dating who he knew as the dentist. They didn't know Charlie's name, but Sigfredo knew she was seeing a new guy and hooking up with him. Sigfredo considered Katie cheating on him with the dentist she was working with at the time. One day, Sigfredo even picked up Louis and almost ran his car into Charlie and Katie while they were eating at a restaurant together. This is a glimpse into what we told you in a previous video, that Katie made sure to keep everyone in the dark about one another. For example, Katie was telling Sigfredo the lady was hiring him to get rid of Dan, and she wasn't telling Charlie who she was hiring to carry out the hit. Sigfredo hated Charlie for dating Katie. It's highly unlikely he would have risked it all for the dentist, and Katie was certainly keeping Charlie in the dark, most likely because if Charlie knew Sigfredo, Katie's ex, was the one who was going to do it, he may not have trusted him to get the job done right. Instead, it seemed as though Katie made it look like she was hiring the Latin Kings, which appeared more credible.
You said a while ago when him and Katie always had him messed up and stuff. What was Katie doing? I mean, you said something about she was going to see somebody and stuff.
Oh, she go see the dentist.
Who's the dentist? Tell us about that.
I don't know his name. I don't know his name, but the only way I knew his name, I guess, I used to talk to my wife, she'd be like this, she's with a dentist. I'm like, oh, this motherfucker. I already knew she was fucking the dentist. He told me his name, but I couldn't remember. Right now I remember his name because it just came to my mind. But at that point, he'd be like, this bitch over here cheating on me. We used to work together. We left the job one day. When we left work, we went to a restaurant. And I said, well, we coming over here for it. Now, because she's over here cheating with me with the dentist she's working with. I'm like, damn. Now, it's like the first time that he told me, like, man, that's fucked up. And you over here stalking this hoe. Like, come on, you're not an ugly guy, man. You go get whatever you want. Like, leave her, but I know he wanted to get the car and smash right through him. Like, yo, I'll get off the car if you're going to do all that stupid shit. If you want to run the car into that restaurant, I'll get off the car.
He was that jealous of her?
He was jealous. Real jealous. He's real jealous about Katie.
But he didn't do that, though, did he?
No, of course not. I think I wouldn't even be here. I think he would have been in jail.
I mean, he never approached that dude or anything like that, right?
No.
He never did that to him.
Louis also explained that he knew that the job was paying at least $100,000 and that he was promised $30,000 and that Sigfredo was going to get about $40,000 and Katie was going to get the rest. And Louis said it wasn't adding up. He knew Katie was getting more than that for this deal. He figured out it was probably the dentist after the hit because he saw all the things that Sigfredo was buying and what Katie was doing as well. And he knew they were both getting more money somehow. We know that Charlie was continuing to pay Katie, and Katie was now back with Sigfredo. So it was obvious that this was hush money to keep Katie quiet. Charlie knew she was back with Sigfredo, but from how he speaks about the hit, it's not clear that he knew Sigfredo was the hitman. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so let's go back to the second time in July when Sigfredo and Louis had to go back and finish the job. This time, Louis had to rent a car because they didn't have another way. Apparently, Katie helped them get the rental car the first time. That's going to come out later. So we went to this car rental place and he got the Prius. And Louis drove this time. They only brought the one small gun. It was July 16th. Let's let Louis tell you about that day.
You said before something about you knew that the total amount equaled $100,000 or something.
Yeah.
Was that before you took the first trip?
Yeah, before he took the first trip, because he told me I'm gonna give you 30, but then he gave me 30. He gave me 37. He gave me 35 first, and then he gave me extra some money on top of it. So it was 37 in total. Then I asked him, how much you getting? He got like 40 something. So I said, how much Katie is getting? Well, she getting the rest. I'm like, hold up. I might be illiterate, but motherfucker, I can count money.
You're saying, what I'm hearing is, I know he already blew all his money, but somehow these things are still coming in.
Yeah, it's still coming in. Like, where it's coming in.
So we move up in time. You said he's talked about going back down. Tell us what's the next thing that happened to make all that happen.
No, the next time that we got to come up here, so we came up. That's when I rented a Prius. We came up. We took the drive up here that night.
You said something to them about he might drive it or no? Was he ever going to drive the Prius?
No. I drove. He drove for a little bit. The night we left, he drove. He took off. But then he was drunk. He's like, you know what, man, you should drive because if we get pulled over, this car's not under my name. It's under your name. So I'm like, you know what, you're right. But then I tell him, I'm in probation, man. If we get pulled over, I'm going to go to jail.
You're saying that to him?
To him. And we get pulled over.
Okay.
So the day we get pulled over, the officer grabbed my license, came back, gave me a ticket. He's like, slow down, put your seatbelt. Gave me a speeding ticket. And I'm on my I looked at Garcia and told him, this motherfucker didn't take me to jail.
So you got a ticket in the Prius
In the Prius.
on the second trip,
On the second trip.
on the way up here.
But when we get pulled over, I tell him, yo, this is a sign, man. We should just turn around. He's like, nah, man, fuck that. We up here. So we drove to Tallahassee. That's when everything happened.
I thought it was interesting that Lewis thought it was a bad sign that he got pulled over, but he was surprised that he didn't get arrested because he was going to turn back. If he got arrested, he was like, that's it. Of course, he was probably going to go to jail. But that didn't stop them from continuing. They got to Tallahassee in the evening and they went to the same hotel and barely slept. They just partied, doing drugs and drank all night. Then on Thursday morning, they went to scope out Dan's neighborhood. Remember we told you in the last video there was an apartment complex behind Dan's and that a resident saw them? Well, that same morning, wait until you hear what Lewis says they saw.
The next day we drove around there. I went around the block. I went around the block to the other park behind his house. He said, pull in here real quick. Let me go see if he's home. So we pulled in. He walked over there. He looked, came back. He's like, go around the house. He said he seen something, but he wasn't too sure if it was somebody. So when I go around the front of the house, that I come back like this. So I'm driving this way. Wendy's walking this way with the two kids. So I'm driving. Before I get to the bump, I'm looking to my rearview mirror and I ask Garcia, man, what's up with this lady? Why is she looking so much? He's like, oh, that's that lady. That's Wendy. I'm like, oh, that's her name. I said, well, so you know, I'm like, okay. I seen the two kids. I said, what's she doing up here? What is she doing up here? Oh no, she came to make sure that everything's alright because he's leaving out of town tomorrow. So it's got to get done tomorrow morning before he leaves.
Was there ever a phone call from anyone around the time that you saw who he described to be?
When she walked, as I'm looking at the rear mirror, I seen her walk a little bit further from her house, get on the phone. By the time we get to the hotel, he's talking to Katie. That's when he asked Katie, what's she doing up here? But I asked him in the car before Katie called, what is she doing up here? He like, she came up here to see if everything's alright with the kids. I said, man, you gotta know something besides that shit. What this lady's doing up here? And she knows that we're up here. She knows you're up here. So what's she doing up here? So when he calls Katie, hey, what's going on? I seen this lady up here. Oh no, she's making sure that everything is fine. That what time he's leaving tomorrow on the flight or where the fuck he was going. I said, so we gotta do this tomorrow, huh? He's like, yeah, cause he's leaving, and she came to see the kids. But I seen her face and everything. I'm like, all right.
So this all happened before 12 noon?
Yeah, before 12.
On Thursday?
On Thursday.
You drove by, you saw her walking the kids. Mm-hmm. You asked him, he says that's Wendy. Mm-hmm. She's making sure that we're gonna do this or whatever.
That she wanted to make sure that we was up there. She thought that we were lying, that he was lying. Cause they don't even know I'm in the car until she seen me that day. When we left, we called Katie. Yo, everything all right with this lady? She's like, yeah, everything's straight. Don't worry about it. Just make sure you get that shit done.
You hear that?
Yeah.
Or he tells you that?
No, I can hear her. I can hear her talking on the phone.
You're in the car or in the motel room?
No, I'm in the car. We're still in the car. We got pulled up. Every time before we go in the hotel, we're sitting in the car for like 10 minutes.
Now, this may have happened because remember on Wednesdays, the opposite parent has the kids. Could she have been bringing the kids back that Thursday morning instead of daycare? They thought this woman lived in Miami, so they wondered why this lady was all the way up there. And apparently Katie said it was Wendy, and she was just checking to make sure everything was going according to plan. Interesting. Mm-hmm. Just to let you know, this has been disputed. My guess is they have enough phone records and GPS to show that this wasn't Wendy, right? Mm-hmm. But for whatever reason, Sigfredo and or Katie were making Lewis think it was Wendy so they'd follow through. That night, they knew they weren't going to do it. They'd wait until the morning of July 18th to follow Dan like they had before, hoping they'd catch up with him this time. So that night, they would drive around looking for drugs. And that's when Sigfredo, who had been drunk and high this entire time as well, accidentally shot a hole right into the floorboard of the Prius and ended up hitting the gas line. That car wouldn't drive. They were able to get in touch with the same guy who had sold them drugs and gotten them to that hotel, and he came to pick up Sigfredo and bring him to AutoZone so he could fix up the Prius, which he did. That night, the drug dealer once again got them a hotel room, and they partied all night. This is the same night when Lewis took a pic of that owl and posted it to Instagram. Katie saw it and called Sigfredo right away and told him to tell Lewis to take it down.
Somebody got to sell coke, but we bump into him in the road.
In the road?
Yeah, in the road. We driving, bump into him.
I thought somebody already had his number.
Yeah, Garcia got his number. Garcia was trying to call him, but he wouldn't answer. He was trying to call him, he couldn't answer. So I told you we bumped him in the road. But he, yo, what's up, dog? He like, my phone. And he like, hey man, we need some party. Like, follow me. So that's when we following him. I'm in the back following him. That's when Garcia, I don't know why. I don't know what he was playing. I don't know why he was playing with a gun. I don't know what the fuck he was doing. I heard, I'm driving, boom, I like jump. Like, yo, what's up, man? You all right? I don't know where I look at the car. Like, they want to move on. Yo, this car is not moving. What you did to the car? I was just laughing because he's so stupid. I'm like, you did this to the car. He's like, oh man, I don't know. I said, we don't got no gas. How the hell we don't got no gas? So we stopped. He looked under. He's like, oh shit, it's a line. I said, you shot the line? Are you serious? So we pushed the car outside the road. The black boy came, he's like, man, y'all come with me to the auto store. I said, I'm not going nowhere. I'm staying in the car. I'm in the car. I'm still in the car. They come back. He's like, man, we got to check the car. I'm like, man, get out the car. He's like, man, get out the car. Fuck, what you so scared of? It's not scary, it's just being cautious, man. I wasn't trying to get seen by nobody. So I got off the car. I'm outside the car, and while they jacking the car, I'm right here talking to the black boy. This nigga stupid, man. He's like, what happened? I said, I don't know what happened. The hose hit something here. I didn't want to tell him what happened, you know? I said, I don't know, I hit something. But he had to fix some small little holes because he's a little mechanic, so he fixed it up.
So then what do you do that night after you're at this new motel?
We're just hanging out. We're just hanging out, just chilling the whole night. We didn't do nothing, stay there the whole night. I parked the car in the back, just sitting there. I didn't do nothing. I was throwing throw a picture of the owl, like I told you. Posted on Instagram.
He saw an owl, a bird, I don't know what kind, it sounded like a barred owl maybe, that landed in the parking lot at the hotel and
Took a picture of it.
scared him.
And what happened after you took a picture? What'd you do?
I took a picture and put it on Instagram.
And then what happened?
Katie calls Doodle. Tell him to take that shit down. If you're stupid or what. So, you know, I'm like, well, I took it down.
That next morning was when the hit went down. Let's hear it in Lewis's own words.
The next morning was a Friday. Friday morning, went to Markel's house. Went over there. I parked by the park again. I waited for him to come out. When he came out, I followed him with Garcia in the car to the daycare. He gets to the daycare. I'm just driving across the street. There was a building. At that moment when I'm pulling in the building, he's coming out. As he comes out, we follow him again. This time we follow him all the way to the gym. Not for a while, for like 45 to an hour at the most. Got there. So when he came out of the gym, I followed him home. As I'm following home, he goes around the back. I go around the front. We met him right in the garage. I was like maybe like 3-4 feet away from his car. Garcia jumps out, goes around the car where he's driving. I think Markel was on the phone that day. Shot him twice, got in the car, we left.
We watched this on the cameras and showed you all of the surveillance from the gym parking lot and the bus camera footage. They didn't talk about what happened after they began their drive back down. But when they were out of town, Sigfredo called Katie and told her it was done and that she better have their money. Katie says, okay, I know, all right. Don't worry, you'll have it tomorrow. At some point, they dumped the gun over a bridge. Lewis even drew a picture of this bridge for the detectives. After this, Lewis said they just went their separate ways when they got back in town. But the next morning, Lewis is at the barbershop and he said he gets a call from Katie now. And that was actually unusual. She never usually called him. And she'd been wondering where Sigfredo was because she's supposed to be paying him. Let's listen in.
Kid driving. We dumped the gun. We dumped the gun towards a bridge. Can't remember that bridge. I wish I could remember if I can show you.
You already dumped it. We know we can narrow
And I
down
even drew
here.
a picture. You want to see it of me this morning thinking about the bridge? That's how much I've been thinking about this bridge all night. Just like that. That's what the bridge look like. The bridge look like that. That'll be me. I had pulled up right there to the side. Garcia jumped off. Just crashed. He didn't go all the way to it. He threw it from there. So I don't know if he made it to the water or not.
But you could see the water from the car.
Yeah,
you
I'm right there. I can see him.
You crossed the bridge and stopped.
The bridge ends here, and it got like a metal. You know how it got the little metal guardrail. He jumped over the guardrail.
Okay.
So it's a concrete wall, then a metal
Yeah,
guardrail.
it's a little concrete wall, metal.
Okay.
And he had to jump.
But the bushes weren't so high that you couldn't see
No,
the
it's just
water.
grass.
Okay.
It's just grass.
Okay.
For this, I want to go back to your driving out of Tallahassee, and you said before that he calls Katie.
He calls Katie. They grabbed him when we had dumped the gun. And then he called her and he said, "Everything is done. Make sure you have my money. I'm on my way." When we get back to the house, he calls, "Yeah, with my money." She goes, "Don't worry about it. You have it tomorrow morning."
He calls her and says,
Yeah, he called her and told her it's done. Everything's done. I think way before we dumped that gun or after we done the gun, but for sure, 100%, he called her and said, "Hey, it's done already."
do you hear her on the other end?
Yeah, I can hear it. She goes, "Okay, I know, all right."
Okay, I know, all
Yeah,
right.
like I'm like, yo, how the fuck does she know? Like, how would she know if this shit done?
But it's Katie's voice.
Yeah, it's Katie's voice, 100%. It's Katie's voice. He can't call Wendy. I don't know her voice. I know Katie's voice.
Okay.
So I'm like, all right. I said, I looked at him like, did you really just call this guy and say you're done? Like, where your mind is at? Never spoke about this again. Never told nobody. The next morning, it's a Saturday morning, I'm in the barbershop. Katie calls my phone. "Where's Tudo at?" Stupid motherfucker don't answer the phone. Just like that. I'm like, I don't know. Let me find out for you. Give me a minute. I call Hibaro. Hibaro go pick Tudo up. So I think Hibaro picked them up, dropped them off in Katie's house. They showed up to my house. I'm still in the barbershop. I'm in the barbershop. My wife calls me. "Babe, Katie and Tudo are here. I got a bag in my hand. It looks like this. It looks like a brick." I'm like, all right, don't touch it. Don't even look at it. I'm on my way. I get there, Katie and Tudo. Katie, "Oh, what's up, Dr. Man? What's up, man? What's up with the bag?" Get the bag. I grab the bag. I take the money out, stick it in my pocket. I said, "Man, what you gonna do, man? I gotta go back to the barbershop. I gotta get a haircut."
But there was something interesting about this money. It was all in $100 bills and they were stapled together in $1,000 stacks. That's very distinctive, something anyone would remember. Listen to Lewis explain what this money looked like.
You also want to know that you got all your money, right?
Yeah. So before I want to make sure all the money's there. So when I didn't even count the money there though. I get there, boom, I drive. I said, all right, go get the bag. I grab the money, put it in my pocket. I go to the car with Garcia. I said, "Do I have to count this shit?" Or what? He's like, "Man, you don't have to." I said, "You know what? It's easy to count because they were all staples to $1,000. So $1,000, it was all hundreds, but a grand staple, each one. So I said, okay, boom, 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 boom. He let me here, let me give you the.
Are you saying stapled or a strap around them?
Staples.
Through the money.
To the money. There's a grand, like that staple.
$100 bills.
10 $100 bills stapled together.
Yes, sir.
Afterward, Lewis called this entire thing a nightmare. He was so upset over the murder, he kept thinking about it, having a lot of regret, so much so that his girlfriend had to call Sigfredo to come set him straight. So Sigfredo came by and Lewis kept telling him he can't stop thinking about the kids losing their dad. Let's listen to him talk about how he felt, and then we're going to tell you something we haven't shared yet.
I even woke up one day, I was in my house drinking. I ain't tell you this though. I was in my house drinking one day and I was so mad I was thinking about the murder. And it was just hitting me. And then he came to my house. Jessica called him, "Yo, come over here and calm this nigga down. I don't know what's wrong with him." He came and told me, "Chill out, man. Stop thinking about that shit." I said, "Man, it ain't even that, man. Like, I ain't do it. How the fuck can you walk around here like that? Something that you did and you out here, like, everything is all right." I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about that man and them kids. Like, it really hurted me, man. It really do.
I know that Lewis is a criminal. And in the last video, we did have someone comment that because we shared about both Sigfredo and Lewis's past, including how they were raised, as well as the influences they had growing up, that we were trying to make you feel bad for them. No, we're just providing the facts. And the fact is, both of these men grew up in the streets. They did have bad influences, and this is all they knew. And you can take that as you will. Do I feel bad for them? In ways, yes, but at the end of the day, they had a choice and they chose this life. It does sound like Lewis had a conscience and he wasn't a killer at heart. He'd done some bad things like robbing drug dealers, but this murder affected him. Who knows if he's just playing with the detectives and lying to make it look like he wasn't such a bad guy. But either way, what we didn't tell you was that a few days prior to this proffer, Little Miss Mastermind Katie McManawa had already been arrested. It was back on October 1st. That morning, she was watching her 4-year-old little girl, Kaylee, perform in a ballet recital. After she dropped Kaylee off at Sigfredo's sister's house so that she can get some things done that day, she was followed by police the entire time. And finally, when she least expected it, they surrounded her vehicle in the middle of traffic. And they came up to her car with their guns out, and Katie was shocked. She really thought that she had gotten away with this. The cops opened her door and were screaming in her face to exit the vehicle with their hands up. She did as she was told, and she was so scared that she actually pissed herself. Yes, she did. But before she knew it, Katie was confronted by none other than Detective Isom, who informed her that he had a warrant for her arrest for the murder of Dan Markel. Katie immediately asked to call her attorney, and they actually allowed her to do so. And her attorney planned to meet her at the jail. During that time, Katie was being handcuffed and put into a police car. Isom gets a phone call. Who do you think it's from?
I don't know.
It's from Charlie Adelson's attorney. That was fast.
Mm-hmm.
And he told Isom that he was aware they had just arrested Katie in the middle of the road in a very dramatic manner. And he said, listen, if you have plans to arrest my client, you don't have to do it like this. Just let us know and he will surrender. Well, damn. Of course, Mr. Maestro doesn't want to feel out of control. He's so used to doing things his way. He didn't want to have to be embarrassed when they came for him. And apparently, he knew he was probably next.
Wow. While all this is going on, Dan's family was getting more and more of the news. Of course, they were happy that the people responsible were getting caught one by one, and during this time, they were introduced to Georgia Kappelman, as well as a new victim advocate, Helene Potluck. These were the two liaisons keeping the Markels apprised of everything that was unfolding. They were thrown into a world they never imagined being part of, as well as a new vocabulary. They were learning all about the American legal system, which they now had to be a part of since they knew trials would be coming. In her book, Ruth said they had to learn new words like defendant, hearings, jury selection, deliberation. She was also made aware that Dan's case was very complicated. Conspiracies have many layers. One thing Ruth cared about most were her grandsons, but she knew she wasn't supposed to be in contact with Wendy, but she wanted to know if Ben and Lincoln were okay. At this point, she had no idea what they were aware of, and of course, with all this information coming out, that they were literally living with the enemy, of course Ruth was scared, so she got permission from Isom to email Wendy through the victim advocates. She wrote, Dear Wendy, it has taken more than a few days to get on my feet. We are concerned. How are Benjamin and Lincoln? How are you? Please keep us posted. Ruth. And you'll probably guessed this already, but she never got a response. You'd think by now Donna and Wendy would have been arrested because apparently the feds believed there was enough connection to arrest them, but the state attorney disagreed. But he was about to retire, so there were a lot of people hoping the next person in line would take his place would move things forward. There wouldn't be a trial for Lewis since he pled guilty, so now the court was preparing to try both Katie and Sigfredo, and Georgia Kappelman would be prosecuting.
Right. And she was from Tallahassee. Not only that, her father, Bill Kappelman, was a very well-known quarterback for FSU, and the community loved Georgia. And remember how many people knew Dan or knew of Dan? It was going to be so hard for a defense attorney from South Florida and criminals from there to appeal to a North Florida community. And of course, the defense wanted to get a change of venue, but that wasn't going to happen. Preparing for trial takes a lot of time, and time was ticking by with still no trial. By January of 2017, Meggs retired and Jack Campbell took his place. What they were hoping was that Katie would take a deal and confess to everything, but she wouldn't budge. She was even offered immunity in exchange for what Lewis gave authorities, the truth. But Katie insisted she was innocent and she wasn't going to admit anything that she didn't have a part in. Eventually, Georgia made motions to try both Sigfredo and Katie together. Neither one of their defense attorneys wanted this, but there had already been so many delays that it was going into 2019. Judge James Hankinson decided to grant Georgia's motion to combine the trials, and the date was set for September 26, 2019. We really don't want to bore you with this entire trial. You can go watch everything. I will leave a link below for the Law and Crime playlist, where you can experience the entire thing yourself. We already have. There were 2 defense attorneys, one representing Katie and one for Sigfredo, and they'd go back and forth cross-examining all of George's witnesses. Katie was not facing the death penalty, but her boyfriend, the father of her children, Sigfredo, was. It was front page news in Tallahassee.
Dan's parents and sister were in attendance. Katie and Sigfredo wore suits and had cleaned up well. They looked nothing like they had in their mugshots. They even put Sigfredo and Katie in a pair of glasses.
Yeah, I always looked at that and I'm like, okay, like it's going to make a difference. It's kind of laughable.
Right.
We'll just throw a pair of glasses on them and we'll hope that people will just look past all the evidence. They even had Katie wearing a wedding ring, even though she and Sigfredo were never legally married. And all of this was to make it appear like she was an innocent, upstanding citizen.
Georgia's opening statement laid out everything you already know and set out the prosecution theory that Katie had been solicited by her boyfriend at the time, Charlie Adelson, to find someone to kill Dan. Charlie would fund the hit, and Katie would get a portion of the money. Why? Well, Georgia revealed that Wendy's mother despised Dan and wanted the problem taken care of. We think it's important to at least let you hear Georgia say some of this herself. So let's hear a portion of that in our opening statement.
Donna Adelson despised Dan Markel and was desperate to find a way for Wendy and these 2 kids to move down to where she was located in South Florida. Donna Adelson in these emails refers to Dan Markel as a religious zealot, a bastard. She says, let's show this F blank, 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 what will make him absolutely miserable. And specifically, one of the last pleadings filed prior to Dan Markel's murder is in reference to Wendy Adelson's mother, his mother-in-law, Donna Adelson. And in this pleading, he alleged that the children's grandmother, Donna Adelson, was disparaging him to the kids, and he was petitioning the court to order that Donna Adelson not be allowed to have unsupervised contact with his children, her grandchildren. A ruling was never made on that motion because Dan Markel was murdered before the hearing was conducted. Wendy Adelson was interviewed, as I mentioned, and she will tell you that she sure hopes someone didn't do this on her behalf. She'll tell you that Charlie, quote, looked into hiring a hitman, but decided buying her a TV as a divorce present would be cheaper. So Wendy's brother, Charlie Adelson, has made references to hiring a hitman to kill Dan Markel, and now hitmen have murdered Dan Markel.
It makes sense, doesn't it? Well, according to Sigfredo's defense, not at all. Yeah, his argument is that this was all orchestrated between Charlie Adelson and Luis Rivera. Even though, let me be clear, we've never seen any proof that the 2 of them had any communication, but Sigfredo's attorneys insisted that Luis, being the primero of the Latin kings, he was a leader. He was very smart and dangerous, and he knows how to cover his tracks, that he was lying to the investigators to get his own freedom, when all along, he was actually Charlie Adelson's drug dealer. And he had his own ties that didn't involve Sigfredo, which honestly, when I was listening to this, made no sense. We know the connection is Katie. It's obvious. But Sigfredo's attorney is trying to make the jury believe that Luis is lying and that he was the one that actually shot Dan. Why else would he be given so much money just to ride along in the car? It didn't add up. So let's listen.
So wait a minute. Let me get this straight. Supposedly, Sigfredo Garcia was hired and given $100,000, and he decided, because he's such a wealthy guy, to bring you in to do nothing other than drive you up to Tallahassee twice for $35,000? You know, 2 and 2 has to equal 4, okay? Luis Rivera also wants you to believe that Katie Magbanua was solicited by Charlie Adelson, okay? Now, the evidence is going to show that my client has children with Miss Magbanua. He loves her. That's his girlfriend. That's his wifey. But they were going through a rough patch. And you know who she was dating? She was dating Charlie Adelson. The evidence is going to show that Charlie Adelson's a smart guy. Charlie Adelson knew Sigfredo didn't like him. Charlie Adelson also knew that crossing, when you make that decision, if you're going to solicit somebody, if you have the option of Luis Rivera, the primero of the Latin Kings. Primero Latin Kings means you're the head of the Latin Kings. And as the primero, which means a leader of the Latin Kings, he had access to other Latin kings. So if he wanted to go up to Tallahassee to commit a murder, you think he would take a gun? No, because he's a convicted felon. He'd be riding dirty. That means he'd be riding with a gun. No, what does he do? Picks up the phone and he calls one of his brothers up north. That makes sense. That's what the head of a criminal organization would do. This is not a street-level thug. This is the primero of the Latin kings. And so, Luis Rivera, a known drug dealer, a known supplier of, he is a pharmacy, from soup to nuts, from steroids to cocaine. He supplies them. And it's our position that he has a relationship with Charlie Adelson. It's our position that he was the drug supplier for Charlie Adelson. And Charlie Adelson made a decision to instill and to solicit this murder for hire from Luis Rivera.
Yeah, that just makes no sense to me. I see where he's trying to go with it, but it is a stretch. It makes way more sense that Charlie and Katie worked all of this out together and that both Luis and Sigfredo didn't even know Charlie was the one that hired Katie. Remember, they thought the lady, who they later find out is named Wendy Adelson, was the one with the problem. But here comes Katie's defense attorney, and she's arguing that Katie is totally innocent. How? Well, it all stems around that call that Sigfredo made to Harvey's cell phone on July 1st. This alone is pegged as the connection. But we explained to you in our last video, I think, that this was actually Sigfredo thinking he was calling the dentist to cuss him out over Katie being with him. He hated Charlie, and that's clear from Luis and even Katie herself. But her attorney's insisting all that money that was deposited in her bank account was actually from her working at nightclubs for cash, and that she didn't know that Charlie was planning a hit, that she was totally in the dark about who was planning it and who was carrying it out. She was just blowing up Sigfredo's phone all those times that we saw on those records because he's just the father of her children. And when she needed something, she would call and text or do whatever she could to get in contact. It wasn't about a hit. And I have to say her attorney was pretty believable. I think it's because she actually believed Katie, the poor thing. So let's listen to that argument that she told the jury now.
Prosecutorial desperation. That is the only reason why Catherine McBanwell is sitting before you today, charged with a crime that she had absolutely nothing to do with. The prosecution's relentless obsession with arresting the Adelson family has led to this day, this moment, in this courtroom, where an innocent person is being accused of a crime that she did not commit. She is also a very strong woman. She's one of the strongest women I have come to know. But her major downfall is her taste in men. And at the end of this case, you are going to see that the only thing she is guilty of is having horrible taste in men.
See what I mean? It is a little convincing. The jury doesn't know everything that we do. So they could believe that poor Katie was only guilty, as her attorney said, for choosing crappy men. That's the only thing she's guilty about. To drive her innocence home, Katie decides to testify, to take the stand herself. And it truly does appear like she's telling the truth, that she didn't have any part in what happened. But Georgia is so good at what she does. They had plenty of connections between Charlie and Katie that didn't make sense. And as she cross-examined Katie on each and every one, the cash, the gifts, even the fact that Wendy said her brother never gave gifts to his ex-girlfriends. And yet, after Dan's murder, not only was Charlie still giving Katie gifts, but he also put her on the payroll. Katie argued that that was just a favor. But Georgia was like, why would Charlie do that? Was it to keep you quiet? To keep you happy? But of course, Katie plays dumb, saying things like, I don't know. I don't recall. Let's listen.
Did you have anything to do with the murder of Dan Markel?
No, ma'am.
Did you get the father of your children, Mr. Garcia, to commit a murder on behalf of Mr. Charlie Adelson?
No, ma'am.
Do you remember Charlie Adelson at that Dolce meeting telling you that you should call the number and tell the person that he is, or you are willing to help out the person, but it was a one-time deal and it was just for charity?
I only remember that because a portion of the tape where you had some transcript, and I might have read that part, but I don't remember that from that day.
Okay. And so if he was going to keep this person quiet through the guise of an act of charity, that would be kind of similar to how he kept you quiet, right?
No, ma'am.
I mean, he gave you a lot of gifts, didn't he?
Which gifts?
Well, he gave you a paid-for trip to Santo Domingo for you and Mr. Garcia. Is that true?
No, that's actually for my children and I visiting his parents, his mom, my mother-in-law.
Did Charlie pay for it?
Yes, ma'am.
Did he call in prescriptions for you, Mr. Adelson?
Did he call in prescriptions for me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, he has before.
Okay. Did he pay for a meal service for you?
Yes, I remember that.
On May 20th, 2015, do you recall sending a text to Mr. Adelson asking him for money?
I don't remember that.
Okay. And do you remember Mr. Adelson giving you $1,400 6 days later?
I don't remember that.
Is that something you would remember?
Yes, if he gave me that amount of money.
But your testimony is you don't have any recollection of him ever giving you any cash.
Yeah, I don't remember that.
And you never saw any cash in his place when you were over there.
No, I don't remember that.
Did he offer to let you use his boat?
He's offered, yes, but I never took it.
What about his limousines?
I paid for the limousine service. I mean, I had the cash for it.
So you paid for all the things that we just talked about in cash?
I don't remember. I don't recall if I made some with my credit card, made some with my, paid some with cash.
And how much cash did you typically have on hand?
It depends. Like whatever amount that I make in the club and like I start saving up, then I put it away. So I can have between $2,000-$3,000 on me.
When you say put it away, what do you mean?
Like put it in my bank.
Okay.
Like I'll save it up in my house and then I'll put it away when I get a chance to go to the bank.
Okay. But all these things that you have paid for, like, let's just take the breast augmentation, for example. You
Yes,
indicate
ma'am.
you paid for that.
Yes, ma'am.
But there, if you're putting your cash in the bank, there's no cash withdrawal to correspond to you paying cash for that breast
But I
augmentation.
wouldn't take, I'm not going to deposit money that I'm going to use already. I already saved up that money for my
Okay, so you would
breast
save the
augmentation.
money separately, not deposit it.
Well, I
and then
knew,
pay
yeah,
cash.
because I already had my consultation in the beginning of that year, the beginning of 2014, so I was already saving up
Okay,
so that when I get them. Go ahead.
You were saving up for the breast augmentation.
Yeah.
But
I
you
already had
needed Charlie Adelson to put you on the payroll so that you could get insurance for your kids.
it. I was saving because I've always wanted my breast augmentation.
Okay.
And the insurance for my kids is because my son had a disability, so I had to do a bunch of therapies for my son.
Okay. And you heard that Wendy Adelson testified that she's never known her brother to give any gifts to any ex-girlfriends. Did you hear that?
No, I don't recall that.
Okay. Well, what makes you so special that Charlie Adelson wanted to give you all these things after the end of your relationship?
All these things, like you make it seem like he's giving me all of this stuff out of the blue.
Yeah. I do make it seem like that. Why is he giving you all this stuff?
I don't know.
Why did he put you on the payroll? Is that as a favor?
Yes, ma'am.
Not as payment for a murder?
No, ma'am.
Not to keep you happy?
Why wouldn't he just pay me the cash? Why would I have to get a check from somewhere?
I'm going to ask the questions, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So he put you on the payroll 2 months after the homicide, yes?
2 months after the homicide, I started. Yes, ma'am.
All right. And were you involved in a sexual relationship with Mr. Adelson at that time?
I'm not 100% sure, like at the time frame. I believe so.
Okay. So you were still sleeping with him after the homicide?
I believe so.
And was there an actual job opening at the Adelson Institute that you filled with this position?
No, ma'am.
All right, so it's a position that he created for you.
Yes, ma'am.
And Georgia even ties a nice bow around the fact Katie was the mastermind connecting the two parties, the Adelsons and the hitmen, but never letting either side know who was who. It's pretty smart. Georgia even asked her, so when was Sigfredo aware that Charlie was a part of all this? Let's play it.
When did Sigfredo Garcia find out that Charlie Adelson was involved in this conspiracy?
When did he find out?
Yeah.
I believe when he got arrested.
What about when you came home after meeting with Charlie Adelson at Dolce Vita? Did you tell Mr. Garcia that you'd met with Mr. Adelson?
I don't know about the time frame again. I don't know if when I came home, I said that I spoke to Charlie.
Would you agree in the calls and texts that follow that meeting with Mr. Adelson, Mr. Garcia is really angry with you?
Yes.
Okay. And he said in that text that we listened to recently, or somebody read from the stand, whatever is going on with you and your homie is your business. You guys work that shit out. Don't text me. Who's your homie in that sentence?
I believe he was referring to Charlie.
Right. And he was angry to find out that Charlie was involved, wasn't he?
I believe so, yes.
The Adelsons weren't in the courtroom, though this was the father of Ben and Lincoln who was killed. Strange, right? But Wendy was. Not only was she there, she actually testified. She was called as a state's witness. Her attorney was able to get a deal for her, an immunity deal. She would testify, and what she said on the stand could not be used against her later in court. But it's not full immunity from charges. She can still be charged if the state were to find evidence connecting her to this conspiracy. And she wasn't exactly a willing participant in court. She's what would be referred to as a hostile witness, someone there because of legal obligation, a subpoena. And she was an attorney, so of course she didn't want to do anything that would cause her to lose her license. But the whole time she would refuse to answer the easiest questions from Georgia. She wouldn't even admit to things like that her family was wealthy.
She'd respond like, what do you mean by wealthy? It's just like, answer the question. It's so simple.
Let's play that clip.
Are you asking me to speculate?
No, I'm asking if they're wealthy. You may, if you don't know, you say you don't know.
It depends how you define wealthy.
Okay. Are they millionaires?
No.
She wouldn't even agree that they were wealthy. I mean, come on. It's obvious they were, right? I mean, she had a tennis court growing up in her backyard. That speaks wealth.
Yeah, exactly. And relative to others, that's wealthy.
She put on such an act. And remember, her mother always said that Wendy was a great actress
when she wanted to be.
That's right. She also said she liked living in Tallahassee.
That is such a lie. I'm sorry. I couldn't take it. And I was like listening to her, I'm like, okay.
She even disagreed that her parents were overly involved in her life and her divorce, and we know that they were involved. We've heard it from Donna herself in all those unhinged emails. We've heard it from the people close to Wendy, like her ex Jeff, who claimed her parents still treated her like a baby. We heard enough to know that this is all a lie. She even tried to convince the jury she was happy that the judge refused to let her move to Miami with the kids.
Yeah, right.
When we all know she was the one that petitioned the court to allow it. Instead, she smiles, saying that she was pleased she got to keep the job she liked as a professor at FSU.
And were your parents very involved in trying to facilitate that relocation?
My parents were supportive of me moving to South Florida.
Would you describe your parents as being over-involved in your personal business?
As compared to other people's parents?
Yeah.
I don't know.
And you mentioned that you did develop a desire to move to South Florida. Did you file a motion to that effect on January 14th, 2013?
That sounds, I did file a motion. I don't remember the exact date.
Okay.
But that sounds about right.
All right. And in that motion, did you make some allegations that Mr. Markel was making things difficult for you at work?
I did.
And was that motion granted or denied?
That motion was denied.
All right. Denied with prejudice?
I don't remember.
Okay.
If you have it, I'm happy to take a look.
Okay. But in any event, you were not able to move at that time?
I did not move.
And were you upset about being stuck in Tallahassee?
I was relieved.
You were relieved. You wanted to stay in Tallahassee?
I was happy at my job.
This is just laughable because remember, according to her own book, she made fun of having to live in Tallahassee and she felt like her job was subpar compared to Dan's because she was a spousal hire. and she only got hired on account of Dan's deal with the school. So none of this made sense, but the jury doesn't have all of this information. She's also pretended she didn't even recall the motion where Dan was seeking sanctions against Wendy herself and her mother. Remember that? And her lawyer. And it's almost impossible as a lawyer herself not to remember a motion, especially against her and her own family. But again, she plays dumb. She even says she doesn't think her mom or anyone took Dan's motion seriously. Wow. She cannot be serious. So let's listen.
And the motion to preclude your mom from having unsupervised contact with your kids, that was still pending at the time of his murder, correct?
That's possible. I mean, I don't think anyone took that motion very seriously.
Okay. Did your mom take it seriously?
I don't think so.
Did Dan Markel take it seriously?
I don't know how Danny felt about a motion. If he wrote the motion, he was probably taking it seriously.
My favorite part was when Georgia confronted Wendy with those emails from Donna that we read to you in a past episode. These emails included Donna calling Dan Gibbers. Georgia asked if this was a nickname that they'd come up with, and Wendy said, oh, yeah, it was a name given to Dan when he was being difficult, but it wasn't meant to be derogatory.
Notice in the emails that your mother referring to, who I think is Dan Markel, as Gibbers. What does that mean?
Gibbers was a nickname that I gave Danny when he was being really difficult and causing me a lot of pain. Was sort of a nickname I gave him to make him feel less threatening.
So it was a derogatory thing?
I wouldn't say it was derogatory.
Did you call him that to his face?
No, I called him Danny to his face.
Okay.
So Georgia caught her in a lie because the judge was like, well, how do you spell Gibbers? And Miss I don't recall said she wasn't sure because she doesn't think she's ever written it down.
And Gibbers would be what? How would you spell that?
I don't know that I ever spelled it out. In the emails, I think it's spelled with a J, but I guess you could spell it with a G.
Jibbers.
That would be one way to...
Well, Georgia blew that one up by interrupting Wendy with this.
Ms. Adelson, you had Mr. Markel's phone number programmed into your phone as Jibbers, didn't you?
That's right.
If you didn't catch that, Georgia was like, Wendy, you have Dan's number programmed into your phone as Jibbers. And Wendy looks like a deer caught in the headlights. That's her favorite look. And she's like, right, that's right. And she says it with a straight face while she's saying it. Wow.
Georgia asked Wendy if Charlie ever mentioned hiring a hitman to kill Dan, and Wendy actually says no. So Georgia asked if he ever joked about it, saying that he looked into hiring a hitman, but it was too expensive, so he bought her a TV instead. Wendy admitted that that was true. Let's hear her talk about that.
Did he mention hiring a hitman to kill your husband?
Objection, hearsay.
Overruled.
No.
Did he ever joke about he looked into hiring a hitman, but buying you a TV as a divorce present would be cheaper?
He did make that joke. He tended to repeat himself, and sometimes he would make jokes that weren't very funny about all kinds of things.
All right, and was that TV, did he buy you a TV as a divorce present?
He did.
And was that TV the same TV that was being repaired at your residence at the time that your husband was murdered?
It was.
Who made the arrangements for that TV repair?
I did.
Your mom didn't make those arrangements?
I don't believe so.
Interesting that she said her mother didn't arrange the Best Buy appointment. And we know Donna called Wendy to let her know the details about the repair. And also that Best Buy called Donna to confirm the appointment. Georgia asked her point blank if Wendy was involved in a plot to kill Dan, and she said no. And she also said no to knowing anything about anyone conspiring to kill him.
Charlie ever say that he considered all possible options to take care of the problem being Dan Markel?
No.
Were you involved in any way in a plot to kill Dan Markel?
No.
Do you have any knowledge other than the statements you said your brother made or the jokes your brother made? Do you have any knowledge of anyone being involved in a plot to kill your husband?
No.
The thing is, we have Jeff Lacoste on the stand pretty much rebutting everything Wendy said. First, he says she was bitter about not being able to move to Miami, and that on July 13th, Wendy confided in Jeff that her brother was looking into options to take care of Dan. And a couple weeks after Dan was murdered, she even admitted that she went with Charlie to a celebration dinner where Wendy threw up at the table. This was supposedly because Charlie confirmed that he had Dan taken care of. And she even tried to suggest that Jeff was a suspect. Remember that?
Were you aware during the course of your relationship with Ms. Adelson about her efforts to relocate to South Florida with the children?
I certainly was.
And was Ms. Adelson happy about the fact that she was not able to relocate?
No, she was quite bitter about it, actually. It was, as I said, a topic that came up, that tone came up on those first 2 dates.
Right. Did she make any statements to you in reference to her brother considering options to take care of this problem with her not being able to relocate?
Yes, she did. Yes, ma'am. On July 13th, 2014, Wendy and I were speaking, and she asked me if she could share something with me confidentially. I told her sure. She mentioned, or she said, that Charlie had explored all options to take care of the problem, and that he had looked into having Professor Markel killed. It would cost about $15,000. I later talked to Investigator Isom and said that could have been $50,000. They sound an awful alike.
Okay, so you're not sure if she said 15 or 50.
That's right, but I'm confident she made that statement. I just can't remember the exact dollar amount. And she did state that was during the relocation battle the previous summer is when that had taken place.
All right. Did Mrs. Adelson tell you anything about the celebration dinner? Anything about a celebration dinner?
Yes.
Could you tell us about that, please?
Yes. A couple weeks after Professor Markel was murdered, we spoke on the phone, and she had mentioned that her and Charlie had gone to, these are her words, she said, Charlie and I went to what he described as a celebration dinner.
All right. And that was the dinner where she vomited?
That's right. That's correct.
And are you aware, Mr. Lacoste, that Ms. Adelson suggested you as a possible suspect in this homicide?
Yes, I am.
And where were you when Dan Markel was murdered?
I was on the road to Tennessee.
But Wendy had an excuse about why she threw up at dinner. She said she was so upset over Dan's murder, she couldn't eat for like a month. And then when she was finally ready to go out to eat, finally having a meal, she and her brother sat down and they got sat at the bar and she drank on an empty stomach. Let's hear her tell you the story.
After the murder of Mr. Markel, did Charlie Adelson take you out for a celebration dinner?
No.
Do you recall any dinner where shortly after Mr. Markel's death where you were with Mr. Charlie Adelson and vomited?
I do remember that dinner. I'm sorry?
Go ahead, I interrupted you.
After Danny died, I was terrified that someone was going to come after me or my children and harm us as well. And so I didn't leave my house for about a month. And when I finally felt ready to leave the house and have dinner, I told my brother that I wanted to have dinner, that I was ready to finally go to a restaurant and eat a meal again. And I'd barely eaten for a full month, just out of grief and shock. And so that night, when I finally ate for the first time, they ended up taking a while before they sat us, and they sat us at the bar, and I had a drink, and I wasn't used to eating anything or drinking alcohol, and I threw up at the table, the only time in my life I've done something like that, but it was certainly not a celebration.
And you never heard your brother refer to it in that way?
No.
Yeah, right, Wendy. She always seems to have an excuse, when the most likely scenario is so much easier to believe than her excuses, like how she didn't really go to the crime scene on the same day of Dan's murder. Oh, and I loved that testimony. Georgia went hard on Wendy, even pointing out that she purchased a brand of bourbon called Bullet, not Boulet, Bullet. And it's just funny that she can't remember. You'd forget that you bought Bullet bourbon the day your ex-husband was shot with 2 bullets? How? You wouldn't. It's impossible.
And Georgia also wants to know why Wendy went so far out of her way to go to a liquor store near Dan's home where the murder had just occurred, when she could have gone to so many others closer, and why she visited the crime scene at that moment. Wendy was like, I didn't visit the crime scene.
Yeah, we have to play that because it's too good not to.
It was my first time purchasing bourbon.
And do you remember what type of bourbon you purchased?
I don't.
Does Bullet bourbon sound familiar?
Maybe.
And did you make any stops between leaving your residence and going to the liquor store?
Maybe I purchased gas?
I don't know if you did or not, but I'm referring to your visit to the crime scene.
I did not visit the crime scene.
You did not pull up to the crime scene tape on Truscott Drive?
No. I was driving on Centerville Road, and sometimes I would take the shortcut through Truscott.
Yes, ma'am.
But when I was driving on Centerville Road, I saw some sort of tape or obstruction, and so I didn't turn.
No one is stupid. We can see all of the connections. She's very careful with her words. She's an attorney after all. And when confronted about whether she moved to Miami right after Dan was killed, she acts as though, in her words, she only packed a weekend bag when we know that her and her parents packed up her whole house. And she never came back permanently. All lies. She was living there for 5 years at this point.
Did you move to South Florida after their father was killed with the children?
So after he was killed, I packed a weekend bag and went to South Florida for what I thought would be a couple of days, maybe a week. My son's birthday was July 29th, and I thought we'd be back in Tallahassee by then.
Did you ever come back?
I did come back a few times, but not permanently.
Okay, so you ended up moving there permanently.
I wouldn't say it's permanent, but I'm living there right now.
Okay. Well, it's been 5 years.
It has been a while. I've been exploring options for employment in many different places.
Okay. And when you initially left to go to South Florida, was that the same day as the funeral service for your husband?
No.
Was it the day after?
It might have been the day after or the day after that. I don't remember.
I love how she doesn't know things, even though this is her life. You know that she knows every detail, every single one. She even tried to explain away changing the boys' names too, soon after Dan was killed. Plus, Ben's middle name, which we know is effed up. She tried to claim that that middle name that Dan went into detail about on his blog that was in honor of his grandma, Wendy said it was actually to honor her grandmother. You just have to listen to this because I can't take the lies. And the statement she made about how she was confident that she would not be charged in connection to Dan's murder. How can you be so overconfident? Okay, here we go.
Did you change your children's last name from Markel to Adelson?
I did.
When was that done?
After Danny died, there was a lot of press coverage, and CNN put pictures of my children's faces unblurred on national television. Newspapers put their names without any consideration to the fact that they're children. And
I appreciate that, but the question is when did you change their names?
When they started school, I registered them under my name, hoping it would keep them safe.
And was that approximately a year after their dad was killed?
It was whenever I registered Ben for school, so it was soon after. Okay. But I didn't legally change their name until after that.
And did you also eliminate your older son's middle name?
When I legally changed their names, I did.
And you just dropped that from the name?
I did.
Okay. And that was a name that came from Dan Markel's deceased maternal grandmother, is that correct?
The name started with an A, which was to honor my grandfather, Aaron Adelson, and the second half of his name was to honor Danny's grandmother.
Okay.
So we lost an honor to both families.
Now, you are testifying today under a state subpoena, correct?
Correct.
And that state subpoena gives you immunity for your testimony, right?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury, since you're an attorney, what immunity is?
Immunity is freedom from prosecution.
So that means that anything you say today can't be used against you if the state decides to arrest you later on.
The state isn't going to decide to arrest me.
What is so funny? That's just so cold. And honestly, I can't wait until she is arrested because, well, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. let's just wait.
So wrapping up this trial, they had Lewis take the stand and tell the same story you heard him tell Isom in his proffer. The prosecution had over 40 witnesses and showed close to 200 pieces of evidence, including all the recorded conversations, not just the ones we showed you in the last video, but so much more. And then it was in the jurors' hands, 10 women and 2 men. And wow, was there drama behind the scenes. The group of jurors already got a late start that day. It was 4 p.m. once they got into the deliberation room. They were served dinner while they talked about the case amongst themselves. They didn't rush, they took their roles very seriously, and they had a lot to think about. Not only come up with a verdict for one defendant, but 2. They started by focusing their attention on defendant number 1, Sigfredo Garcia, who could be put at the crime scene. The video evidence was the most compelling, actually seeing Sigfredo in the green Prius, the ATM video, and of course backtracking, seeing the same Prius on the bus footage, also at the gym surveillance. It all added up to guilty. But it wasn't that easy just to come to a verdict because the law stated, according to the jury's instructions, that just because someone is at the crime scene, it doesn't mean they're guilty of murder. The jury members were so split on whether it was Lewis or Sigfredo that actually pulled the trigger. Both were pointing the finger at each other. Many of the jurors believed Lewis would lie to save himself, and they weren't sure they believed his testimony. I mean, he was a criminal mastermind after all, and he had been in a gang practically his whole life. He was street smart. But the law also provided that if both Sigfredo and Lewis were at Dan's with the intent to carry out a hit in a conspiracy, it didn't matter which one decided to pull the trigger.
Exactly. Under Florida statute section 777.043, in reference to conspiracies, quote, a person who agrees, conspires, combines, or confederates with another person or persons to commit any offense commits the offense of criminal conspiracy, end quote. So there's that part. You are guilty by association, but actually more so the agreement itself, which was apparent here. And then the statute goes on to say, at trial, prosecutors must prove that 1, a defendant intended that a particular crime would be committed, and 2, an agreement existed between the defendant and at least 1 additional person to commit a particular crime. The jurors understood this, and they realized it didn't matter who pulled the trigger. Lewis and Sigfredo agreed to kill Dan. Therefore, if one of them carried it out, the other one would be automatically guilty of the crime of murder. So for now, they thought they had Sigfredo's case figured out, and it was pretty easy for them all to get on the same page. Guilty. But then it was time to look at Katie. And this is when things got complicated. The best evidence in their perspective was Katie taking the stand. So first they discussed her testimony, trying to gauge everyone's perspective on whether they believed that the state proved she was involved or not. So they took their turns sharing their thoughts one by one. And one thing was for sure, no one thought that Katie was totally innocent.
Actually, all of them agreed that Katie's testimony seemed self-serving, which is exactly what it's meant to be. They weren't buying the act. The biggest clue was in the paper trail, the money. Especially since it seemed to increase following Dan's murder. Every juror believed that Katie was being paid by the Adelsons, but there was one juror who didn't. In Stephen Epstein's book, he referred to the juror as a 25-year-old college-educated woman who challenged the other jurors on whether the mere fact Katie was being paid by the Adelsons connected her to the crime. She wasn't sure that the state had met their burden of proof, and things started to break down in the deliberation room. They ultimately became divided.
And it only takes one.
That's right. It's not quite the same situation, but it reminded me of the movie 12 Angry Men.
I thought of that too.
Yeah, I love that movie.
One juror had planted the seed, and that's when a second juror tried challenging her, saying that Katie had delivered the money to Sigfredo and Lewis the day after the murder. But the same pushy juror said, there's no proof of that. However, one of the other jurors was like, that's not true. There is proof. They took out all their notes and reminded the other jurors about Sergeant Corbett's testimony about Katie's phone pings. And we showed you this evidence in the last video. Katie's phone had pinged at the same location as Lewis and Sigfredo's the day after Dan's murder. They were all shown on a map, and their 3 phones were pinging off the same tower. But this one juror said that she didn't recall that, and she wouldn't budge. She literally looked at them and she said, "Show me." So the jurors got together, they got the bailiff's attention to alert the judge that they were requesting that forensic map. But it turned out that map was computerized. It wasn't printed out, and therefore it was not available for them to look at. The judge told them they need to rely on their memory and their own notes. It was already 8:30 at night, and it was time for them to go back to their hotel room. It wasn't possible for them to come to an agreement that night. And they had to be up at the crack of dawn. Breakfast was actually served at 5 a.m., and they'd be back in the deliberation room by 8.
That morning, all hell broke loose in the deliberation room. That 25-year-old holdout juror was not having it. She didn't sleep the night before, and now she was ranting about how terrible she felt putting a mother and a father behind bars and leaving their 2 younger children alone without parents. This wasn't part of examining the law. It was starting to become personal, and the other jurors were getting worried this holdout juror was letting her emotions get in the way. These 2 defendants chose this. It's their fault, not the juror's fault, and they had to buckle down and look at the law.
She even tried to argue that Sigfredo was holding down a real job now. And sure, maybe he'd made some bad choices in the past, but things had changed. But none of that mattered. But here she was appealing to the other jurors' emotions, but it didn't work. The other 11 knew they had one job: to look at the law and apply it to the facts of this case. And you know, I hate to bring this up out of nowhere, but I can't help it. My favorite scene from Legally Blonde is when the professor writes a quote from Aristotle on the blackboard and states, "The law is reason free from passion." It conveys the idea that the foundation of the legal system should be based on rationality, impartiality, and fairness, rather than influenced by personal biases and emotions. And it rings true here. But finally, all 12 were in agreement that they would vote guilty as to Sigfredo's murder charge. So that was taken care of.
But Katie's fate was not yet sealed. The holdout juror stood strong. She wasn't going to put both parents away, but she argued that it was because the state hadn't met its burden to prove Katie's involvement. Soon, there were 2 woman jurors against a guilty verdict for Katie. It wasn't looking good. And granted, the evidence was circumstantial, but we watched the trial and we both thought there was more than enough evidence to prove Katie was not only involved, but pivotal in Dan's murder. However, the 2 jurors weren't letting up, so the foreman finally sent a note to the judge asking if it was permissible to have a verdict on one defendant and a hung jury on the other. The judge said yes, and finally it was settled. The verdict was in. On October 11th, 2019, the judge read the verdict out loud to a packed courtroom.
They found Sigfredo guilty on first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, but not the solicitation charge because they didn't think the state met the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Solicitation occurs by law in Florida when someone solicits another person to commit a criminal offense. During the solicitation, the person must command, encourage, hire, or request that the other person perform specific conduct that would constitute a criminal act. And apparently, they did not think that Sigfredo solicited Lewis or Katie in this crime. It appeared as though Katie was bawling at her seat while the verdict was being read and the jury was being polled. Now, as for Katie herself, let's hear what the judge had to say.
I know that all of you have worked hard to try to find a verdict in this case. It apparently has been impossible for you so far as to Ms. McVanola. Sometimes an early vote before discussion can make it hard to reach an agreement about the case later. The vote, not the discussion, might make it hard to see all sides of the case. We are all aware that it is legally permissible for a jury to disagree. There are 2 things a jury can lawfully do: agree on a verdict or disagree on what the facts of the case may truly be. There is nothing to disagree about on the law. The law is as I told you. If you have any disagreements about the law, I should clear them up for you now. That should be my problem, not yours. If you disagree over what you believe the evidence showed, then only you can resolve that conflict if it is to be resolved. I only have one request of you. By law, I cannot demand this of you, but I want you to go back into the jury room, then taking turns, tell each of the other jurors about any weakness in your position. You should not interrupt each other or comment on each other's views until each of you has had a chance to talk. After you have done that, if you simply cannot reach a verdict, then return to the courtroom and I will declare this case mistried and will discharge you with my sincere appreciation for your services.
Judge actually instructed the jury to go back and to try to come up with a resolution. If they couldn't, then he would declare a mistrial. Katie is audibly crying now. She's blowing her nose, everything. It's finally hit her that Sigfredo, the father of their children, was never coming home, and the jury would soon seal her fate as well. It was a waiting game. Sigfredo was taken away in handcuffs. Now let's hear the jury's decision after they deliberated a second time.
Note as to Ms. McVanowa, the jury is unable to come to a unanimous decision on any of the three charges.
That's correct, Your Honor.
All right, so as to Ms. McVanowa, I will declare this case mistried.
Well, there you go. It was a mistrial. And next was sentencing for Sigfredo. The jury needed to come to a decision on Sigfredo's sentence. They gathered the next Monday, and Ruth Markel took the witness stand to give her victim impact statement on behalf of her entire family. We think it's important for you to hear her words. If you want to skip this, that's fine. But for Dan's memory, I'd listen and I'd hang on every single one of her words the way that entire courtroom did that day. However, we are going to cut a bit of it because the beginning is all about Dan's accomplishments and we've already told you all of it. So let's focus on how this murder has impacted everyone around him. We'll put the link below for the full video in case you want to watch it.
As the court knows, Dan's life was brought to a sudden, abrupt, and tragic end when he was murdered in July 2014. The losses sustained and the damage caused by this crime cannot be overstated. In one fell swoop, our son, brother, and the father of two young boys were all killed. My life was shattered. Dan's death has caused us deep pain that is both disruptive and permanent. After the death of a loved one, you were supposed to face the loss, the void, the experience, the grief, and maybe get closure if you were lucky. When you lose a child, life's progression comes to a complete stop. And the grief comes to a grief stop. When my life was shattered, Dan's death has caused us deep pain that is both disruptive and permanent. After the death of a loved one, you were supposed to face the loss, the void, the experience, the grief, and maybe get closure if you were lucky. But when you lose a child, life's progression comes to a complete stop, and the grief and pain of a mother who loses her child never ends. For me, closure and normalcy are only words in a dictionary, not a reality that I will ever experience again. We have waited for more than 5 years for those involved in Dan's murder to be brought to justice, which has only exacerbated my pain, grief, anxiety, and health. It is very cumbersome to navigate and participate in the legal processes encountered in the days, weeks, and years following the murder. From the day I learned about Dan's death, I experienced a life sentence. But I know that even after justice occurs, Dan's murder will continue to torment me for the rest of my life.
Now here's the judge's sentence for Sigfredo.
As the jury haven't found you guilty of murder in the first degree and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, I do adjudicate you guilty of each offense. On count one, I sentence you to life in prison. Give you credit on that sentence of 1,238 days, which dates back to May 25th, 2016, which I understand to be the date of arrest. On count two, I sentence you to 30 years Department of Corrections to run consecutively to count one. There's no jail credit as to count two since it is a consecutive sentence. As to count three, based upon the jury verdict of not guilty, I adjudicate you not guilty of that offense.
One thing we didn't mention was that while the jury was deliberating, they discussed Wendy's testimony, even though she was not on trial. And many of them expressed that they wished that she was, that they were disgusted, but what they thought appeared to be her apparent white privilege and the fact that she was living her life while Dan was dead, especially since in their perspective, minorities had been doing her dirty work and they were going down for the crime. One juror had actually written "lying bitch" on her notes during Wendy's testimony. They didn't believe her when she said she wasn't driving near the crime scene, and some were disturbed by what they referred to, according to Stephen Epstein's book, as her cavalier response and laughing at the thought of the state ever charging her with this crime. It's clear that she's the reason Dan is dead. The jury even agreed that they believed Wendy knew about the plot before it was carried out. See, even a jury who had way more time and evidence than we can possibly have to rely on believed that she was in on all of this. And all of them relayed to each other that they would have no problem finding both her and her brother Charlie guilty if they were given the chance. Well, as we said, Charlie was already anticipating his arrest coming next. But first, Katie's retrial was scheduled for April 13th, 2020. But when I say 2020, you probably know what came of that. No one knew at the time that the pandemic would close courthouses. And a month before her retrial was supposed to take place, it was postponed again. And then the judge presiding over Dan's case and Katie's retrial actually retired. Judge Robert Wheeler was assigned to replace him. And he has a reputation for being one of the most fairest criminal court judges in the circuit.
Once he was appointed, he had to hear the concerns of Katie's lawyer, who was actually a cancer survivor. It was too risky for her to proceed during the pandemic, so the retrial was postponed to October 4th, 2021, and then again to February 14th, 2022, because of the new Delta variant that was now rampant in Leon County. And with all the time in between, Katie's attorneys filed a motion for Katie to be able to go home while they waited. Well, that motion was denied. She wasn't going anywhere. In the meanwhile, Georgia was getting forensic experts to clean up the audio from the Dolce Vita restaurant. We showed you some of this transcripts without the audio in the last video because even cleaned up, it wasn't that great. But at the time, Georgia knew she needed a solid piece of evidence against Katie. She finally found an expert, Keith McElveen, who worked with the CIA analyzing recordings for over a decade. And he had 12 patents for technology he developed to enhance audio. He was doing his best work on the Dolce Vita audio to showcase what Katie was saying during the conversation. Eventually, in February of 2022, right before her retrial, the prosecution filed a motion to delay again. They needed more time for their expert to work on the audio. The defense wanted the delay as well. They were convinced the audio would exonerate their client, but she was hiding a secret. We'll get into that in a moment. The judge granted the delay, and the new date was scheduled for May 16th of 2022.
What no one on Katie's team knew was that Georgia was planning something big. And on April 20th, 2022, her first step in that plan was being carried out. She was presenting evidence before a grand jury about none other than the maestro himself, Charlie Adelson. And one of the most telling pieces of evidence was that now newly enhanced Dolce Vita audio. The exact version they showed the grand jury was what we put up on the screen the last video. It looked like this, with the words on the bottom of the screen, except they played the audio too. With so much of Charlie's words discernible now, they didn't even need Katie to testify against him. It was as good as a confession in both her mind and the state attorney, Jack Campbell. They were in agreement. There was enough evidence to prosecute and convict Charlie for his part in Dan's murder. That's what got them here in front of the grand jury. Without the media or anyone aware of it, a grand jury indicted Charlie Adelson on April 20th, 2022. An arrest warrant was procured and all they had to do was get him. Now, I've seen a video on YouTube that's supposed to be showcasing a tour of the home where Charlie was arrested. But I dug a little deeper and I noticed the arrest affidavit and Stephen Epstein's book both list 2518 Whale Harbor Lane in Fort Lauderdale as where he was arrested, not the nicer, bigger home that's online with a full video tour. That's another house that he owns, and it is really nice, but that's not where Charlie was when the feds came knocking. That newer home was purchased during 2020. But the one we're going to show you on the screen on Whale Harbor is where he was in his underwear when 20 FBI agents and local officers surrounded the premises at 5 o'clock that morning, weapons drawn. Then they used floodlights to illuminate the entire home and a bullhorn to demand Charlie come out with his hands up. But it was anticlimactic as Charlie never emerged. So they actually resorted to calling him on his cell phone. And surprisingly, Charlie answered and he walked outside as directed. He calmly walked out in his boxers, shielding his eyes from the light. And he asked, "Am I under arrest?" I wanted so badly to yell, "Obviously, dumbass." And so the agents ran over, they cuffed him, they got him some clothing before taking him to Broward County Jail. And man, was he looking rough in his mugshot. I never knew that he had that much hair because it's always like glued in place and slicked back with gel. So of course, as you can imagine, the media had a field day with this picture and of the news that Charlie was finally arrested and Adelson was behind bars, hopefully for good. I wonder if Wendy finally felt like the walls were closing in on her. After all, they were one step closer to the Adelson family. And that scheme was coming undone.
But Katie's trial was still on, and this time there were 6 men and 6 women on the jury, and one of them was a licensed attorney.
And I'm going to cut in because this is actually funny. I was just asking John because I've only gotten jury duty once. I thought about whether lawyers would be excluded from juries. I mean, I don't know everything about that, but let's say someone like me who has a job in true crime. But I guess they don't do that. They can't exclude you because you are an attorney. So my second thought was, well, this time with a lawyer there to really drive home that this is the law and not feelings, I think the prosecution had a better shot. And I also wanted, I know people are going to be like, why do you want to do this? I don't care. I want to proudly say that Georgia Kappelman added an additional attorney to the prosecution. Her name is Sarah Catherine Dugan, who I actually went to law school with. And it's true, we were there at the same time. I graduated one semester before her only because I took summer classes. So we were most likely in a lot of the same classes with a lot of the same professors. And I had to add this because I had never seen someone who graduated with me do something really big like this. So congrats to her and our criminal law professor whose teaching intrigued her to do a judicial externship in criminal court, where she was inspired to become a prosecutor. So she was the one who actually delivered the opening statement in Katie's retrial, beginning with, "Good morning, y'all," which was definitely appealing to the North Florida jurors right away. We're not going to play the whole thing, but I got to give Sarah a few minutes to showcase the prosecution's theory of the case.
Good morning, y'all. Good morning. Thank you for being here today. The reason we're here this morning is because the defendant in this case, Catherine McBanois, set up the murder of a man named Dan Markel. And the evidence in this case will prove to you that the defendant was the link or the middleman between the people who wanted this murder done and the person who pulled the trigger. This murder was set into motion because back in 2014, the defendant had a rich boyfriend named Charlie Adelson. And Charlie Adelson's family had a big problem, and that problem was Dan Markel. And the solution to the problem was this defendant. This defendant was the solution because she had connections to the type of people who were willing and capable of pointing a gun at a stranger, someone they'd never met, and pulling the trigger.
And that's pretty much everything we laid out for you already. Katie helped Sigfredo get the rental car on the first trip in June, but by July, as we said, it was Lewis on their rental agreement. And Katie's defense said the only thing they disagree with the prosecution on is that Katie actually knew about the plan. They insisted that Charlie conspired with Sigfredo directly and not with Katie, but that really doesn't make any sense with all we know. Like, why would Sigfredo, who hates the dentist, go behind Katie's back and conspire with him to do him a favor? That's a long shot, but I guess that's all they really had. There were so many connections between Sigfredo and Katie, though. She's the first one he calls after the hit. Her phone pings at Charlie's the night before she hands off the money to Lewis and Sigfredo, and all 3 of their phones pinged at Lewis's house. She never calls Lewis regularly. but she did that morning. It's all too much for her not to be involved. The prosecution had to put on the same case they did before. Everything we've already heard, piece by piece, for a brand new jury.
That's so much to do again. And all the witnesses were pretty much the same in both trials. And you know what else was the same? So many people talked about this. Wendy's outfit.
Yeah.
And I kid you not, it's exactly the same gray dress with the black suit jacket. Let's put them side by side on the screen. And you'd think from 2019 to 2022, she would have gotten a new outfit for court. But I guess the character that she's playing in the courtroom has a costume, and she probably feels like she's more in character if she sticks with it.
And I bet her lines would be a lot better this time around.
Oh, for sure. She's had a lot of practice. And we are going to share some little nuggets from this trial. First of all, Georgia took the opportunity to clarify Wendy's so-called immunity with her first question when Wendy took the stand. In the first trial, Wendy appeared to be under the impression that she could not be charged in connection with this case because she was coming to court under a state subpoena. Well, Georgia cleared that up pretty quickly, and I just stared at Wendy's shock because I could see it on her face when she realized that she was wrong. And I don't think she's used to being wrong. So let's listen.
And are you here today pursuant to a state subpoena?
Yes, I am.
And do all state subpoenas confer immunity?
I don't know if all state subpoenas confer immunity, but this one does.
Well, okay, and do you believe that your subpoena is special or different from other state subpoenas?
I don't believe it's special or different, so I suppose they all carry immunity.
All right, and does the immunity conferred upon you by the subpoena mean that you can never be prosecuted associated with this case?
That's right.
That's what you think it means?
That's what I think it means.
Okay. And do you think, isn't it true that it's use and derivative use immunity? Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay, but not complete immunity from prosecution. Do you agree with that?
That's different than what you just asked before. So I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
All right, so what I'm trying to allow the jury to understand is what sort of immunity you have. What is your understanding of what it means for you to have immunity pursuant to the state subpoena?
So I have derivative and use immunity. And so in the future, a prosecutor couldn't use what I say here today against me.
Correct. But you could be prosecuted. Just nothing you said here today could be used against you in that prosecution. Do you agree with that?
I suppose so.
Okay.
Yes, Wendy, you can be charged. And honestly, I really hope that she is. Because unlike that one holdout juror, I have no problem putting a mother in jail. She made the choices that she did, and her snarky attitude, her pompous and holier than thou air that she carries, it just makes me cringe. And I've grown to dislike her more and more, especially during her testimony, because as you can see, she's just seething with privilege. She thinks she's better than everyone and even smarter than Georgia. Like when Georgia asked Wendy about how she told Isom in that interview on the first day that she would want the person who did this to be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law, unless it was a family member. Let's play that part first.
Somebody tried to kill my ex-husband. They should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law.
Regardless of who it is.
I mean, it would be different if I thought it were my brother, but I don't think it was my family.
Okay, there you heard it. Now Georgia asked her if she recalled saying that.
Do you recall giving an interview with law enforcement on the day that your ex-husband was murdered?
I recall sitting with law enforcement for 6 hours. Yes, I recall.
And did you tell law enforcement something different in that interview about the culpability of your family?
I'm sure while I sat for 6 hours completely traumatized that I said all kinds of things.
First, I thought it was funny how in this line of questioning under oath, Wendy says that she was in the interview room for 6 hours. But remember her interview on the podcast we showed you last week? In that one, she exaggerated and said it was 8 hours. So listen.
I only found out this information when the police picked me up from a lunch date I was having with 2 girlfriends and insisted that I come with them back to the station and then interrogated me for 8 straight hours, because it's usually the ex-wife.
Now let's see what she says to Georgia. And please listen to her tone and watch the way she speaks, and you will see what I mean by her, for lack of a better word, her bitchy attitude.
All right, and was one of the things you said while you sat for 6 hours completely traumatized that you wanted the culpable parties held accountable unless it was your family?
I don't believe I phrased it like that, and I think you're taking my words out of context, but sure.
But sure?
But sure what?
No further questions.
Also, one of Katie's defense attorneys asked Wendy point blank, if there's one person in this world who would have sent 2 hitmen to kill Dan Markel other than her family, Wendy desperately looks to the judge for help, but she can't get out answering the question.
Can you think of one person in this world that would actually hire two people to go kill Professor Markel other than your family?
No.
Ms. Adelson, please answer. Please address me and answer the question.
It calls for an unbelievable amount of speculation. I mean, I'm responsible for coming up with, that's the prosecutor's duty, no? To figure out who's responsible.
She really looked at the judge and said, Your Honor? She was like looking for a way out, but there wasn't one. And yes, Wendy, it is the prosecution's job to find out who killed Dan. And they know exactly who was involved. They just have to prove it to a jury. Also, Wendy was questioned about why she stopped contacting or letting the boys see Dan's family. And her answer was because she said that Ruth threatened to put Ben and Lincoln into foster care. But that's not how it went. Here's the line of questioning with Georgia so that you're aware of exactly what happened.
Listen, you were asked about the reason why you stopped contact for a period of time between your ex-husband's parents and your children.
Yes.
And you referenced a letter that you characterized as the grandparents threatening to put the children into foster care. Is that an email that was sent from the Markels to my office?
Yes.
Okay. And that was in reference to, in the event that you and the people that care for these children, who at the time were very young, were arrested, that the grandparents wanted to make sure, because they live in Canada, right?
They do.
They wanted to make sure that a specific organization could be contacted to care for the children so that someone was there to care for them until a relative could get there.
I don't remember the bit about a relative getting there.
Okay, well, they weren't just going to leave them in foster care, right?
I don't know.
Okay. But the specific nature of the email, you will agree, was in the event that there's some kind of mass arrest, because they don't know who's getting ready to go to jail next, right? I mean, they're not privy to the investigation any more than you are, right? Law enforcement investigations, they're secret.
Sure.
Okay. And their concern, would you agree the concern ultimately in the email was for the care of the children?
The concern was to make sure the children were under good care, but as their mother, I know they're always under good care with me.
Right, but
and there's no need for foster care.
The email contemplated you not being available to care for them.
That's not possible.
Because it's not possible for you to get arrested.
Correct. Because I've done nothing wrong and I believe in our justice system.
This is only to make sure that the boys were safe in the event that Wendy and her family, the evil in-laws, were all arrested, that the boys would have a place to go in the interim before the Markels could come from Canada to Florida and get the boys. And Wendy still thinks that she won't be arrested. And there was so much talk about WhatsApp in this trial that there's speculation that Wendy and Charlie talked over WhatsApp and that it wouldn't be able to be tracked, that it's much harder to decode messages that were made there. And Wendy admits she has WhatsApp, but she couldn't recall if she had it at the time of Dan's murder and if she corresponded with her brother on there. And that's interesting because all this time I've been wondering if we will learn that there's communication that no one has found yet or that they have found, and Wendy just doesn't know it yet because it takes a while to build a case. And remember that stapled cash? Well, one of Charlie's ex-girlfriends, she testified in this trial that she knew him really well. They dated on and off for 7 years, and she spent a lot of time at his Whale Harbor Lane home. She described him as her best friend and inseparable when they were together. When asked if she had ever seen Charlie with large amounts of cash, she said yes, thousands of dollars actually. So let's listen.
Did you ever observe Charlie Adelson to have large amounts of cash?
I mean, I don't really know what large would be, but yes, I saw cash with him.
Thousands of dollars worth of cash?
Yes.
Where did he keep the cash?
He obviously kept cash in his wallet, and he kept cash in a safe as well.
A safe in his room?
Yes.
All right, and that was at the Whale Harbor residence?
Yes.
Okay, and was it a safe like the size of this speaker on our table, or like the kind that's like the size of a refrigerator?
A larger one.
And was there anything unusual about the way that Mr. Adelson packaged his money? Thousands and thousands of dollars kept in stacks of hundreds.
The thousands that I saw were $100 bills.
$100 bills. And were they stapled together in stacks?
I believe so. I saw like a staple, but this was so long ago that.
Would it refresh your recollection to review your prior statement given on July?
No, I remember it. Like, okay. I mean, there were staples on it. I just don't know. Like, I never saw the money in the safe, so I don't know.
Okay, but you saw money out of the safe being counted, right?
Right.
Okay, and that money was in stacks of $100 bills stapled together.
Yes.
See, there was a safe, and it was a larger one, and he kept the money in stacks of hundreds stapled together. She said the staples were on them. That's pretty telling since we know that Lewis said the cash he and Sigfredo received was stapled.
And I was going to say that this is like really uncommon, but then I looked it up and there were a lot of bank tellers that collect money that have staples in it.
I mean, that's only 10 bills, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I would think like a paper clip would be more reasonable because you're making a hole inside the money and it's actually dangerous. Like people can cut themselves when they're. Anyway, I thought that was a huge connection nonetheless because it's not that common. If the jury can't see the connection, I would be really surprised. But Charlie isn't on trial here. But still, Katie's phone is pinging at his house the night of the murder and with the two hitmen the next morning. And by the way, the reason they were able to make a deal with Lewis is because they compared his story to the facts and the evidence. Everything added up. Even the bullet hole in the Prius, they tracked it down. It had been sold to another company, but they located it through the VIN. And sure enough, it had a hole in the passenger's side floor. All the pings on the phone matched his story, the dates, everything. They didn't just take his word for it. Also in this trial, Katie's best friend Yandra actually had a photo that she took of Katie's kids on the night of Dan's murder, and she had posted it to her Instagram. Katie had never asked her to babysit like that before. And to drive her point home that Katie was in the middle of all this and that Charlie had not been in contact with the hitman himself, Georgia was actually able to play a clip from Katie's previous testimony at her last trial when Georgia specifically asked her if Sigfredo even knew if Charlie was the one behind the hit. Here's how she answered.
Did Mr. Garcia even know that Charlie Adelson was the one paying for this murder?
Repeat that question again.
Did Mr. Garcia even know that Mr. Adelson was the one behind this whole thing?
Well, what time?
Ever.
I really not.
I know it's hard to hear, but Katie said she did not believe that Sigfredo ever knew that Charlie was behind all this. That cuts through her whole defense argument in this trial. That's their whole case. In the first trial, they were focused on Lewis being the one that Charlie was in contact with, since Lewis was already behind bars. But in this trial, it switches to Sigfredo because he's now behind bars, another scapegoat. But clearly, the defendant herself had just stated they were not in contact. The money was the last thing the prosecution focused on, making sure the jury knew Katie was not just getting paid well at nightclubs. That wasn't why she kept depositing all that cash. So they called one of her bosses from Fate nightclub, who testified that the employees made about $500 a weekend at most, and only about $200 a night if it was a good night. And that most of the patrons paid with credit cards, not cash, and the employees would later get that on their paychecks. He said it usually wasn't even enough for them to cover the cost of the credit cards being run. And altogether, it's important to understand it doesn't add up. And Katie was only working there for maybe 3 months. And we know how long she was putting all that money in her bank account.
We think the most telling testimony was from Luis Garcia's longtime girlfriend, who he considered a wife, Jessica Rodriguez. She'd known both Luis and Sigfredo for a solid 12 years, and she had initially crossed paths with Katie through Sigfredo around 2013. Jessica believed that Katie and her bond was quite strong, but it soured later on, particularly after the case gained media attention as Katie began ignoring Jessica's attempts to reach out through messages and calls. But Jessica was there when Sigfredo and Katie came by with the bag of money on the morning after Dan's murder. Her testimony was very damning. She had just given birth to her and Luis's daughter, Lulu, at the end of June. She had actually seen the green Prius before the July trip, and then this is what she said happened the morning after Dan's murder. She's off camera for privacy reasons.
When was your youngest child born?
June of 2014.
Did you ever see him in possession of a green Prius?
Yes.
After your child was born, so similar to the time frame I'm talking about, trying to narrow it down to the time that he took that trip, after that occurred, was there a time when someone brought a package to Luis Rivera at your home?
Yes.
Who brought the package?
Tuto came knocking on the door. He brought the package.
All right. And was there anybody else present when Tuto brought the package?
Yes. Katie.
Who else? Katie?
Yes.
Is that Catherine Magbanua?
Yes, ma'am.
When this package was delivered, did both Tuto, Sigfredo Garcia, and Catherine Magbanua, the defendant, did both of them come into your residence?
No.
Okay, tell us about that.
So Tuto knocked on the door. I opened it. He came in. He said he had a package for Tato. He went to the room to drop it. I said, "Who you with?" He said, "Katie." I went outside. We had like a little patio hallway. And I screamed over and I'm like, "You're not going to come and see your niece? Like, why are you in the car?" And then she got up and then she came in.
So she did come in and see the baby?
Correct.
All right. And at some point, did you call Luis Rivera to tell him they were there?
Yes.
During the time that Catherine Magbanua was coming up to see the baby, did she ever acknowledge the package or say anything about the package?
Yes.
What did she say about the package?
Basically did, to my knowledge, if I remember correctly, did you give him the package? But Tato wasn't there.
Okay, so he hadn't arrived yet when she
Correct.
made the statement. Okay. And so who is she asking, did you give him the package?
Tuto.
All right. And did she seem like, what was her demeanor like? How was she acting?
She was fidgety.
Okay.
Like in a rush.
Okay, what do you mean by in a rush? Did she say anything to indicate she was in a rush?
No.
Okay. But she just was acting like, what, like she was ready to get out of there?
Yeah.
All right, and just to clarify, she specifically asked Garcia something to the effect of, did you give him the package?
It's pretty obvious that Katie was involved and that everything her defense was trying to argue happened to cover her ass isn't true. The last piece of evidence was the Dolce Vita audio and video. The jury wasn't allowed to see the transcript that the grand jury had seen and what we showed you, and we will put it up on the screen right now, but they were able to listen through with individual headphones. But after all the witnesses had come forward, it was once again the jury's turn to deliberate and to decide if the state had met their burden this second time. They began just before 1 p.m. on May 27th. Right before 5 p.m., the jury requested the Dolce Vita audio in its entirety. The judge ushered them into the courtroom and they took their seats and listened to the 40-minute audio, then went back to the deliberation room again. Finally, that night, after 8 hours of deliberating, the jury reached a verdict. Let's listen.
In the case of the state of Florida versus Catherine D. Magbanua, case number 2016 CF 3036, and 2018 CF 497. We, the jury, find as follows as to count 1. A, the defendant is guilty of first-degree murder. We, the jury, find as follows as to count 2. A, the defendant is guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. We, the jury, find as follows as to count 3. A, the defendant is guilty of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. And it is signed and dated by the foreperson.
Well, that's not a surprise to me, but it definitely seemed like a surprise to Miss Magbanua, who you can hear crying, now knowing that she too won't be going home to her kids. And is it sad? Yes. And I'm getting personal. This is TMI, but I spent almost a decade away from my father growing up because he too made bad choices and went to prison. And yes, it's sad. But a parent should have thought about that. And Sigfredo and Katie should have as well. I'm really sad for their kids that they had parents who were selfish about money and put them in such a terrible position. But enough with the emotional stuff. Katie was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She really should have taken a deal. But she took her chances, and you may wonder why. Well, remember I said that she had a secret? The secret she was hiding was the truth. She lied at both of her previous trials. Yep. And you will hear her admit to that. So recall I said I felt bad because I thought her lawyer actually believed her. I think she did. And she was fighting hard for her client. But now the state had to prove that Charlie was guilty, and Katie was the closest person to him during the time of Dan's demise. Therefore, they needed her. So on September 29th, 2023, Katie turned state witness and signed a proffer agreement, the details of which promised her nothing on the record, although it's safe to assume that after the prosecution gets the rest of their convictions for Dan's murder, that Katie will probably be recommended for parole to the parole board because she's finally willing to cooperate and bring the rest of the players down. As part of her statement, she explained that she couldn't take the previously offered immunity deals because she didn't want to testify against the father of her children. By lying in court in her previous 2 trials, she thought that she still had a chance of getting away with murder. But now she's desperately trying to save herself any way that she can. So I know you're going to hate us, but we've decided to come back and finish this case in the next video. So join us next time as we dive into the next layer of this case and bring you closure, as well as some updates so we can keep you up to date as things progress. We want to thank you so much for watching.
And as always, don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell so we can keep bringing you up to date on what's happening.
Thank you so very much for watching. We will see you in our next episode.
Bye.
Bye.